Time is precious, and we are so delighted that you all are spending some of your time with us this evening. My name is Grace Allen. I am the Chief Operating Officer with the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence. And I'm here so interested in the shorter working week while I was a public representative in Ireland. And we're not just famous for good crack and good music in Ireland. We designed and developed the very first 4-day week pilot programme that you may have read about in the media. And tonight you're going to hear from the person behind those trials, Joe O'Connor. Time is our most valuable and non-renewable resource, and I believe that it is time for a shorter working week. And there's nothing like an idea whose time has come. But you don't have to take my word for it, because tonight you're going to hear from leaders that are making that happen. Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence are absolutely thrilled to partner with Danielle Farage for this event. Danielle is a digital nomad who has first-hand experience of living the future of work. For the past number of years, Danielle has worked in the HR technology industry, helping organisations navigate challenges posed by the pandemic. I'm going to welcome Danielle up to the stage, and she's going to kick things off for us.
First time meeting or our second time or first time in person. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming. Time is precious, as we know. I'm coming off of an entire trip in Europe, the Middle East, partially for work, partially for play, and just finished the Jewish holidays, where it was a time of reflection on some of the Jewish holidays. So I'm feeling like, plus the rain, we all probably need to take a deep breath. So I would love to lead us through just a few breaths, just to get us all on the same page and in the same vibe. So if you could, your feet on the floor, sit upright in your chairs. Also, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I just feel like it's the right thing to do. And if you feel comfortable, you can rest your eyes closed. Just let your breath go. Let it be normal. Breathe in, normal, breathe. Tune into, how am I feeling today? Was today a good day? Was today a less good day? Was I excited about today? Think of one thing that maybe was positive about your day. Or something about to eat a really nice breakfast. Or messy. And just bring it in. And out. And just take one more in. And sigh out. Let's take one more collective breath. In. Sigh out. And before we open our eyes, keep breathing inwards. I want us to think about how valuable our time is. How people seek to take our time. And how protective we need to be of our time. Because it's valuable. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And now we have it. So welcome. My name is Danielle Farage, and I'm a meditation teacher. I'm just kidding. But I'm probably would have had you fooled. So I am really passionate about the future of work. More so, I'm passionate specifically about how do we integrate all voices as we approach and reimagine what the future of work would look like for all of us. For people who've been in the industry for many years, to people who are really just starting their careers. How could we make the workplace a better place for us all? And my focus the past few years have been on early career talent the short end of it is that I went through a toxic work experience right out of college, even given that I was trying to avoid exactly that. And once I found the right workplace for me, I realized how important it actually was. I went from depressed AF to feeling so aligned, feeling empowered, fulfilled, and like I was being poured into. And the juxtaposition of those two experiences is what led me to ultimately start speaking about the importance of culture, of treating your people right, from as early as when we start working. And so I started to become an advocate for people, of course, in my cohort, Gen Z. But realistically, the types of solutions I'm talking about extend beyond just Gen Z, right? And so, of course, start small. I'm starting to really venture out into my own as an entrepreneur. So, and specifically, my focus is becoming how do I encourage young Gen Zers or young professionals to find fulfilling and empowering careers, because that's possible, and not is therefore. And how do I help organizations to actively encourage and uplift and empower young professionals, given this seat at the table? So that's what I'm up to right now. And I partnered with Joe and Grace because I wholeheartedly believe in solutions-based approaches and uplifting and getting the word out about solutions-based approaches to the future of work that actually work. And I didn't feel like there were enough spaces to talk about that. So that's why I wanted to team up. And I'm a big fan of what they're doing. And so yeah, I'm excited for more conversation around this. Obviously, always happy to talk about Gen Z, because that's me. And yeah, put your hands together for yourself for showing up.
Danielle, and we're going to get an opportunity to hear from Danielle again. She'll join the panel and she'll be part of our Q&As and program. We're really fortunate to have amazing sponsors. This lovely venue, Oasis by Workville, is pretty cool. I'm sure you can agree. We delicious food, I'm hungry, thank you very much. And we have, this wouldn't have been possible without our sponsor, the Digital Wellness Institute, and we have Tyler Rice with us. And I'm going to welcome Tyler up, who's going to tell you a little bit about his organisation.
Thank you, Grace, so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Tyler Rice. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer at the Digital Wellness Institute. And on behalf of my co-founders, my entire team, and myself, we're just so pleased to be a part of this event, to be able to meet in person, to be able to gather in person in an age of hybrid and remote work, when so much of our time is spent truly behind a screen. So show of hands, who after this event plans to potentially go back to the laptop, open it up, fire up a few more emails before tomorrow? Anybody? Anybody? Just me? Okay, all right. So at the Digital Wellness Institute, we truly believe that digital wellness is an integral part of work time reduction. Since 2020, the daily average screen time of all employees has increased to staggering 5 hours per day compared to pre-pandemic levels, and it hasn't decreased. So we had an assumption, we had a hypothesis that more time on screens was leading to more burnout. More burnout was leading to less productivity. Less productivity was leading to that work pile being stacked up on each and every one of us here at our desks, leading to us feeling like there's nothing else to do. It led to feelings and issues like the Great Resignation. And right now, we're still lacking a balance. We're still lacking some semblance of normalcy in this digital age. So at the Digital Wellness Institute, what we do is we advise organizations on how they can help create a digital culture. We certified the first digitally well workplaces in the world and started up in Canada with our friends at ATB Financial. We've even pivoted to universities and certified Virginia Tech as the first digitally well university in the world. So as a result of our initiatives, we've ended up increasing workplace productivity by about 20%, decreasing attrition by 10%, and that's just from education, empowerment, and creating a culture of digital balance. So if you guys want to talk to me afterwards, I would love to connect. We're actually looking for 2 to 3 pilot organizations that we can leave here with tonight that would like to sign up for a short micro habit platform that we're digital wellness mindful moment to their workflows. We piloted this last week with a number of organizations we've worked with in the past, and we had some amazing results. Now I'm really curious if an organization has never heard of digital wellness before, they have the exact same results. So if you're interested, please find me again for 2 to 3 organizations. Thank you so much for having this, Chris.
And you obviously all have that information there for you. So next slide. Now, I was telling you about those pilot programs earlier, and next we're going to hear from Joe O'Connor. Joe is the CEO and co-founder of Work and Production Centre of Excellence. He's also the director and co-founder of Freedom Canada, and he is the former CEO of 4-Day Week Global. So Joe, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. I talked pretty loud and I wasn't planning on using the mic. Does everyone feel like that's okay? Yeah, right. Okay. All right. I don't have a clicker, so I feel I've got kind of a German 80s DJ set up here in front of me. So, hi everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Joe O'Connor. As Grace said, I'm the director and co-founder of the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence. I first got interested in the subject of work time reduction and the shorter work week back in Ireland in 2018. I was leading a research project on work-life balance in the Irish public sector. And one of the big findings that we had from that research that's really stuck with me in my career ever since is that we had a huge volume of working parents, mostly women, who were already working shorter work weeks or reduced hour work weeks within the Irish public sector. But when we actually dug into the data and we started interviewing their managers, interviewing the employees, we found that their expectations in the job were largely the same as they were when they worked 5 days. Their responsibilities were largely the same. The output that they were producing was largely the same. So that got me interested in this idea that actually, is it possible to produce as much or more even when we work less? And over the last number of years, I've been leading pilot programs as the CEO of 4-Day Week Global, involving hundreds of companies and thousands of employees all over the world. But what I'm going to try and do over the next 20 minutes or so is talk to you a little bit about why is the shorter work week movement gaining traction and momentum all over the world, how are companies doing this, and what does it all mean for the future of work. So we're just going to start off by maybe moving back a little bit and talk a bit about the history of the work week, because this conversation that we're having about the shorter working week is not a new one. In fact, the idea of the 8-hour day, the weekend, the 5-day week as we know it today, is something that actually had its origins over 2 centuries ago, in 1817, where the campaign for 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, and 8 hours rest first originated. And then it took more than a century before the 5-day week became normalized, became popularized, and was enshrined in legislation here in the US and across most of the Western world. We saw pioneering business leaders like Henry Ford in 1926 introduce this in Ford Motor Company. And over the course of the last century, we've seen people like John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, predicted in 1930 that by the end of the last century, we'd all be working about 15 hours a week as a result of the kinds of advances in productivity and technology that he predicted. Even Richard Nixon, who's not somebody that you would expect to see on a slide in relation to the future of work, the former US president, he predicted back in 1956 that we were on the cusp of a 4-day work week, which would lead to a fuller and a fairer family life for every American. But it's only really been in recent years, starting with the Icelandic government and their pioneering pilot in 2015, that the idea of the shorter work week is really starting to gain momentum. If you look at this data, which is some economic data on annual working hours per worker over the course of the last half century or so, you'll see that the decline in average working hours, which really started at the beginning of the last century, continued to fall right from 1950 up to around the late 70s, early 80s. This is data for the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And since then, we've really seen a flatlining in work time. So we have pretty much the same work week structure and the same average work hours as we did a few decades ago. And this is despite globalization, the advent of the internet, digital communications technologies like email. So I guess the question is, why is it that we're working as much as we used to, despite the productive capacity and the technological tools that we now have at our disposal? And so if you look at today, it's clear that in recent years, the openness amongst employers and the interest amongst employees for the idea of the shorter working week has hugely grown and accelerated. This is very recent data from YouGov in the UK, which shows that 64% of business decision makers, so this was a survey of more than 1,000 business decision makers, said that they strongly supported or somewhat supported the concept of a 4-day working week, which might surprise you. That even increased to 76% when we're talking about large businesses with more than 250 employees. And this data is borne out here in the US and Canada as well. 69% of senior managers in Canada expect their business to move to a 4-day work week in the next 5 years, according to Robert Half. 57% of business owners in the US responded to BTB reviews to say that they were willing to pilot the 4-day working week to assess its impact. And then if you look on the demand side, on the employee side, we see consistently through the data, 83% of Americans think they could complete their weekly workload in 4 days. 57% of Canadians list this as one of their top 3 most attractive employment benefits, ahead of flexible working and remote work options. And very interestingly, at the bottom, as we have these back to the office conversations, when offered the binary choice between working 4 days fully in the office and 5 days hybrid, in a survey of more than 15,000 British workers, 2/3 of people said that they would prefer to work 4 days in the office. I'm just throwing that out there as an interesting topic of conversation. So why is it that organizations are starting to move to a shorter work week? Well, in my experience, it tends to fall into one of 3 categories. Either they are doing this to try to boost employee engagement and in turn to boost productivity. They're doing this to address underlying issues around employee well-being, burnout, and unsustainable workloads. Or they're doing this as a recruitment or retention tool to help them to attract and retain top talent. And in some cases, it's one or more of those things, or some combination. I want to now talk a little bit about what we mean by the shorter working week, because this is something that it's getting a lot of headlines, it's getting a lot of coverage, but there's often a lot of myths and misconceptions about what exactly it is that we're talking about when we talk about a shorter working week. So when we talk about the organizations that were involved in these trials, we're not talking about compressed hours. We're not talking about squeezing the same number of hours as people previously used to work in 5 days into 4. We're talking about genuine work time reduction. This is effectively a trade between employer and employee, where in exchange for reduced hours and the same salary, employees commit to maintaining the same level of output, which in turn means increasing hourly productivity. So this is about maintaining output, but it's not about the same inputs. This is not about doing the same work in the same way in less time. This is not about speed up and intensification. This is about redesign. This is as much about changing the way that we work as it is about changing the number of hours that we spend at work. And this is linked to a couple of very important concepts that really play into how you can make a shorter work week a success. The first is the Pareto principle. This idea that in many organizations, 20% of the effort leads to 80% of the impact. So really the shorter work week is an exercise in prioritization. It's about figuring out where is the low value activity, where's even the no value activity, and how do we eliminate that or minimize that in order to create the time and space for people to really focus in on the things that matter, on the things that really drive value in their business. It's also linked to this concept of Parkinson's law, which some of you may have heard of, this idea that a task will expand to fill the time that's available for its completion. So once you create an intentional constraint around time by moving to a shorter work week, you put pressure on your systems and processes that really forces you to streamline your operations, improve your processes, and change your work practices. So Grace mentioned the trials earlier. I was involved in my previous role as CEO of 4-Day Week Global in coordinating trials all over the world, here in North America, in the UK and Ireland, and also in Australasia, involving hundreds of companies, thousands of employees, as I mentioned earlier. The most recent set of results, which came out here in the US and Canada, involved 41 companies, 32 American and 9 Canadian. And really, the most, I think, incredible result from that is that all 41 companies said that they wanted to stick with the policy at the end of the trial. So nobody was abandoning the 4-day work week at the end of the 6-month trial. And you'll see here on this slide some of the results from that from an employee perspective. We saw increases in life satisfaction, in work-life balance, decreases in burnout, improvements in mental health. And we saw for organizations, we saw reductions in attrition, so less people were leaving the organization, reductions in sick leave and absenteeism. We saw increases in revenue year on year. I think really interestingly in the top left corner, we talked a little bit about Gen Z earlier. I think there's definitely some signals that for younger generations, this time-money trade-off, there's starting to be some differences of opinion on that. I think for younger workers, the value of more time off after several decades where most academic historians would say that we've chosen consumption over leisure, that we're starting to see a change in that people are prioritizing experiences, sustainability, time, balance. And so when we asked employees, what would it take? What kind of a pay increase would it take for you to move back to a 5-day work week now that you've had the experience of trying out a 4-day work week? 33% of people said a pay rise between 26 and 50%. 12% of people said it would take a pay rise of more than 50%. And for 14% of people, no amount of money would entice them to go back to working 5 days, having experienced a 4-day work week. And this is not something that just small to medium-sized enterprises are doing. We're now starting to see huge global brands like Unilever in Australia, who've had such a successful trial there that they've extended it now to their entire Australasian division. We see Avon Bank, the challenger bank of the UK, Awin, the global marketing platform, all finding great benefits for their organization and for their people. And increasingly what we find when we work with these organizations is that the shorter working week is actually already here. It's just buried under the rubble of things like poorly run, overlong and unnecessary meetings, distraction and interruption in the workday, poor use of technology, and outdated, inefficient processes. And once you put in place a framework and an incentive structure to address these kinds of underlying inefficiencies in your business, you find that offering a shorter work week without impacting the bottom line is often well within your reach. So this is something that can really act as a very powerful incentive to drive employee engagement and motivation. There's a huge psychological and behavioral dimension to this, which is often overlooked. I've heard so many leaders say that when you offer people something that is so genuinely life-changing and transformative as a shorter working week is, whether it's family, caring, community, having the time and space for rest or for new hobbies and endeavors, this changes people's lives. And as a result, if you link this to very clearly defined objectives, in other words, if you say, we will offer you a shorter working week if we're able to make these things work for the business, people are incredibly focused and motivated to do whatever it takes in order to be able to make it a success. And if you look at the kinds of different options that are out there for HR leaders, for people leaders, when it comes to workplace flexibility, here in the US, one very popular one is the idea of universal paid time off, universal holidays, which I must admit, I'm not a huge fan of. And this is similar to this idea, we've seen this kind of libertarian concept almost of, people work where you want, when you want, as long as the work gets done. Well, there's two weaknesses to that approach that I just want to put forward. The first is that when you design a model that's very based around individual discretion, what tends to happen is that you get uneven access and distribution, depending on what team you're working, who your manager is, what the attitude amongst your colleagues is. And secondly, from a business perspective, if everything is left up to the individual, then there's no collective responsibility and collective action. So this is something that actually, when you make the benefit fair and universal, there is an opportunity to create something that drives collective responsibility and collective action. And this is something that doesn't necessarily just mean a 4-day work week. There's lots of organizations who have moved to models like shorter work days, 9-day fortnights, 4.5-day work weeks, flexible Fridays where you remove all fixed meetings or work commitments from the calendar. This is something that can be an incremental step on the road to moving to a shorter working week, or for some organizations, this can be a really big achievement. So we talk about this in terms of a roadmap. For some organizations, the starting point is different, and for some organizations, the end goal is different. So I've had some law firms, some marketing agencies come to me where their leadership is really excited about the possibility or the opportunity to move to a 4-day work week. When you look underneath the hood, you find that these organizations, their people could be working 45, 50, 55 hours a week. So actually, initially, this isn't about changing the structure of the work week. This is about finding the efficiencies to give people back more balance within their existing workday before you can even contemplate the idea of moving to a shorter work week. So I think this is something that's really linked to the conversation around remote work. First of all, for organizations that have successfully adopted remote first or remote heavy work models, often leaders would say that actually the shift to remote work was a bigger challenge than the shift to a shorter work week. Because once you get remote work right, once you figure out how to get asynchronous communications, outcomes-based measurement in place, the transition to a shorter work week becomes much easier. But I think for too long we've become fixated, and you see this in some of the back to the office debates at the moment, fixated on location of work, when actually we need to extend the conversation not just of where we work, but also how we work and how long we work for. And I think that's really where the shorter working week comes in. And we're also seeing this other huge debate in HR circles and communities right now around the rise of generative AI and the kinds of powerful new technologies that we now all have at our disposal to find efficiencies. And I think there's an opportunity here where work time reduction can accelerate the adoption of AI in organizations, where actually this change initiative, you're no longer saying to people that in order to become a market leader on this, the only reward is going to be creating time and space for more work. We are actually sharing the benefit of adopting these new tools and technologies with people in a very tangible, meaningful way in the form of reduced work time. And of course, AI can create the capacity to reduce work time within organizations. So many of the companies that are referred to have used technology to automate certain tasks, to streamline administrative processes in order to move to a shorter work week. Now the scope and the potential for that is so much greater than it even was 12 months ago. I think this really could be the next big thing that accelerates the growth of the shorter work week movement. So I think there's an opportunity for strong organizations who are proactive, who are innovative, who are forward-thinking to get ahead of the curve. I'm convinced that the market leaders of tomorrow are not going to be the organizations that tell people that they need to grind for longer, to hustle harder, to work longer. They're going to be the organizations that embrace new technologies to optimize productivity. They're going to be the organizations that are an employer of choice who attract and retain the best talent by offering people the thing that really matters most, which is a greater quality of life. And so in conclusion, this is something that I genuinely believe can be a triple dividend policy. This can benefit our economy, it can benefit our society, and it can benefit the environment. I think we've moved to a world post-pandemic where quality of life between organizations, between industries, between countries is becoming a new frontier for competition. And this is really an opportunity for organizations that have a strong culture of trust and a strong culture of experimentation. So surely more than 100 years after we invented the 5-day working week, it's now time for an update. So thanks very much for your time. I'm looking forward to the Q&A later.
Joe, I'm actually going to get you to say that because I think it will be a nice opportunity. We're going to keep the Q&A to the end, but if you don't mind, I think it will be a nice opportunity just to open to the floor. If anyone has any questions at this point, if you want to put any questions to Joe now, before we move on to the next one.
I'm curious if you can talk at all about the Netherlands, where they have a 32-hour working week, and it's very competitive countries who are talking to very countries. So in terms of where they are, what they've been doing in terms of like the whole country, it was 35 hours, and it's now 32 hours. So do you have data or examples from there in terms of how that worked out and what was, how that went?
So I don't believe there's a legislative shift to a 32-hour work week in the Netherlands.
That is 35.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
35, but then
Yeah,
I
so
don't think she said I don't do 35 anymore. It's less than that, but at least it's not.
sure. Yeah, I mean, and if you look at countries like the Netherlands, Germany, many of the Scandinavian countries on the OECD data, they are much lower than the US and Canada when it comes to overall working hours, and they're also much higher when it comes to productivity and most of the competitiveness scores. So I think, if you look at that macroeconomic data, you're right. It really pushes against the idea that working longer hours necessarily makes you more productive. And that's the case in the Netherlands. We've seen it in Iceland, where that was a much more structured government-based program. We've seen in Belgium, they originally brought in legislation which was around compressed hours, so offering people the option to work 4 days, same hours, and they're now moving towards a reduced hour version of that. So I would say it's interesting, and I think it's something to do with the structure of the economy. Most of the momentum in Europe is very public sector driven in terms of pilot programs, government initiatives. In the US and Canada, it's much more private sector driven.
Sure, everything is here. I mean,
Yeah.
that government is, very, very good country and federal as a state as well. I'm just curious that you didn't use more that to show that it's successful.
Sure.
So, that was, it is very prevalent in other countries.
Sure.
Anybody else?
You mentioned that people had predicted that they were going to become sooner. Why did their predictions fail? And why now? Why should now be the time to do it?
I would say a few things. First of all, without getting, I think a big part of this is if you track the decline of collective bargaining, if you track the decline of the influence of the labor movement, I think that's definitely got something to do with it. I mean, I think, it's pretty clear that over the last number of decades, most of the productivity advancements have been, have gone to shareholders to a much greater proportion over, the balance between labor and capital has kind of been moving in one direction for quite some time now. So I think that that's one big component. I do think, and I touched on this, there is a choice component as well, where we've had several decades where people have, leaned towards salary, compensation, consumption over leisure and time, and that has kind of gone down the priority order in terms of, bargaining, in terms of, what people's priorities are when they're, hiring for a new job or when they're trying to, progress in their careers. I do feel a shift in that. I think that for younger generations, that people's priorities are different. I think even for some older generations post-pandemic, people's priorities have shifted. So I think that that's here to stay, in terms of this becoming something that could really be a very significant differentiator and tool for competitive advantage for organizations, for in particular younger workers.
Did the compensation change in the fields? Either during the pilot or for the future? Do they get paid for 4 days? Do they get the same salary?
So for none of the companies in the trials, the prerequisites for participation were same salary, had to be a genuine reduction in work time, so it didn't necessarily have to be 20%. If you look at this, it was more of a 14-15% average reduction in work hours. So there were lots of different structures, but it was a requirement that it wasn't a kind of a cost-cutting, pay-cutting exercise. But I would say this, having spoken to lots of leaders who've done this 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, they would say that when it comes to annual pay rises, if the market says 3 to 5%, they can probably get away with being on the lower end of that if they're also offering a 4-day work week. So there probably is a long-run deflationary effect on rises, but the organizations I've worked with, there was no pay reductions involved whatsoever.
So in the trials that you've done, have you noticed the trends in terms of what types of workers to want and specific and what types of interactions play out?
I mean, I guess it depends what we mean by this. If we're talking about 4 days, 32 hours, absolutely that's not going to work for every company. I think it's going to be a different form of work time reduction. I think sometimes that argument can be a bit mischievous in the sense that often the examples people use are workers in industries or organizations that aren't currently working 5 days, 40 hours. Nobody, certainly not me, is arguing that we should have people who are currently working overnight shifts move to 4 days, 32 hours, Monday to Thursday. So it's going to look different for different organizations. In terms of the companies that have done this so far, it is leaning, I would say, white collar, what used to be very office-based jobs, knowledge work, creative work. That's where the volume effect is for sure, which isn't the same thing. I've seen examples in manufacturing and hospitality and retail, but the numbers are definitely smaller. And I think a lot of that is to do with in those industries, it's not as heavy of a lift. We've seen it work in other settings, but I think it's not as straightforward. It is definitely more complex.
Take one more.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can hold it. Okay, thanks. First of all, I want to preface the question by saying I'm all for all of this, and I especially love your slide about how you helped companies reduce work hours every week. Shorter meetings, just like making the work more efficient, and especially because you mentioned knowledge work, creative work. I know that kind of work often requires, downtime, fringe time where people who work together can be together without, working towards a deadline, with like outside of meetings, water cooler talk. Like, this is where so much innovation happens. So, and again, I see this everywhere, people talking about almost obsessively, like, how can you make meetings shorter? And again, I'm all for it, but I worry that like companies that do this might miss out on some of the innovation that comes like in the 65th minute of the 1 hour meeting. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very common concern that, if we're doing this, and this is at its heart an exercise which is really about kind of reducing waste or inefficiency in order to create capacity, that you're going to lose that kind of water cooler time and collaboration. I think you need to be very intentional in the design that is not wasted time, that is incredibly important time for leadership development, team building. So, when it comes to meetings, we have this concept which is like, do, learn, decide. If your meeting isn't to do something, to learn something, or to decide something, it should not be happening. So, it is about how do we reduce the time, how do we structure the agenda better, how do we, make sure that there's not 10 people on a meeting where there could be 3 and the other 7 get the notes. I think nobody in the room would say that they don't recognize that there's an awful lot of inefficiency within meetings. I think it's kind of separating out the idea of you have all of these blocks of time, standing meetings stuck in your calendar versus creating time for creativity, ideation, collaboration. That's a separate thing, which is a whole lot of value.
Okay, conscious of the time. If anyone else has another question, then you'll get another opportunity to speak to Joseph. Thank you again, Joe. Okay, now it's an opportunity to get under the hood and figure out how companies are making this work. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Rakiba Kabira. Rakiba is the VP of Revenue and Common Future, and yes, you guessed it, they've successfully moved to a shorter working week. And interestingly, a partner of ours in the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence, Banks Benitez, was the CEO of Uncharted. And Uncharted amalgamated with Common Futures. And as far as I know, that's the first ever 2 4-day work week companies to amalgamate. So that's pretty incredible. Rakiba is the VP of Revenue and Common Future, as I said. She is a lifelong learner, a mom, a partner, a daughter, and a plant lover. She comes from a lineage of refugees, liberation fighters, community organisers, educators, and farmers. Rakiba has a tough love for the not-for-profit and philanthropic sectors, which have been her professional home for 14 years. At Common Future, she leads the revenue team to fundraise for community power solutions that advance racial equity and economic justice from the ground up. In her free time, and this is my favourite part, she likes dreaming up how to create a world and raise a daughter outside of what the dominant imagination tells us we can and we can't do. She is a first-generation Bangladeshi American with a strong Queen's NYC pride. Her lived experience and love for her people ground all the things that she does. Rakiba holds a BA from American University in International Development and Economics, and an MS from Columbia University in Nonprofit Management, where she was also an associate instructor for the program. So I'm going to ask you an interesting thing now. We're going to take this session over here. So So if you wouldn't mind swiveling your chairs, or if you want to move closer, please do. We're going to do the interview over here, and I'm going to welcome you to the stage. So please feel free if you want to come closer.
I can project as well. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I think you're okay. Too shy. Okay, so thank you again for being here. Okay, I'd like to go back. So you're a working parent, and you're a person who likes to do things differently and think outside the box. So can you talk to us a little bit about what was the initial motivation? You know, do you remember that first conversation about what it is you're working?
Yeah. So thanks so much, Grace. It's lovely to see everyone here. Thank you for introducing Common Future. We're a national intermediary. Our roots are in Oakland, but our 40 staff members are all across the United States with me here in Queens, New York City. When we really pride ourselves in our culture values, and the number one culture value that you'll see on the Common Future page is we center equity, we are the communities we serve, we reimagine what's broken, we find collaborative ways of solving problems, and I'm forgetting the last one, we experiment in new ways of working, when we were revisiting our culture values, this is pre-pandemic, actually, because we do a culture survey equity audit each year. We were really thinking about, okay, so we show up for communities of color across the country as a nonprofit intermediary, delivering programs and services and co-creating with community partners, and also as a grant maker or investor into communities, right? How are we showing up for our own people that are majority people of color staff, right? And what we were seeing from the culture surveys is, and one of the most daunting questions was, do you feel supported in your work-life balance by Common Future? Are you satisfied with your physical health and your emotional well-being? And those answers really were like harrowing to us. Like, oh, are we not taking care of our own people? What's happening here? So when we started looking at, well, how do we rethink about this? Joe, to your question, it really began how we redesign our work. And in turn, how do we redesign our time, right? So we began asking the question of, okay, what is on people's plates? Are we doing what's essential? What's most impactful? Are people prioritizing appropriately, you know, and not just falling to the trap of outputs and activities over impact and outcome, right? And in having these discussions, ahead of a staff retreat, we asked staff members to read Essentialism and really think about like what is essential part of their job descriptions, and what can they let go of? What can we bring automation into to make our lives easier? And in doing these and having smaller focus groups, we really realized that, hey, you know what? We want to experiment with our time. That's the first place we want to try. So 2021, so a year into the pandemic, you know, the whole world is chaos. We're like, all right, Memorial Day to Labor Day, we're going to run this experiment to see how it goes. And then we'll revisit it after we come back. And lo and behold, like, you know, the experiment was really, really effective. The pre-survey and post-survey after the experiment told us everything that we wanted to know. All of our deliverables, all of the projects that we were working on, the things that we were trying to accomplish, whereas normally we would complete it around 84% of the time or something around that range, that shot to 92%. Where about 39% of staff members felt like they were very dissatisfied with their physical health, 29% with their emotional health and well-being. Those reduced to 5% and 9%, you know? And overall, just like the satisfaction of being part of an organization that sees you for your humanity and not just a transaction of your labor did wonders to the morale of the team and how we came together as a remote team for the impactful and good work that we do every day.
Those are amazing stats. Wow, incredible. Something I see companies
some companies do wrong is that comms piece, the communication. So you've had this great idea. How did you communicate that internally to make sure you're bringing everyone with you? So was there any hot water in that was tricky?
Yeah, so our internal communications, we had a lot of focus groups. Parents first, supervisors, early stage professionals, and led like, do y'all know the rocks analogy? Rocks, pebbles, sand.
Yes.
And so I think it's Stephen Covey, but
It is.
yeah. So we were going through like, okay, what do you fill your days with? Let's go through it and have conversations with real radical candor, where it was all hands on deck, no judgments, and really coming together to reevaluate what's on everyone's plates, right? So ran a lot of focus groups, redid everyone's job descriptions, and they had to do it. It wasn't like a top-down kind of thing. It was bottom-up. So each person had to revisit their essential job description from the places that were additive. They can only do what they were hired to do, and no one else can do it. Those things, that's your like value proposition to your organization. What was redundant? What was admin that often fell on the burner, or things that they want to do and never have time to do, and really revisited roles. And that's how we kind of integrated it into internal policies. We also had a communicate. So externally, we had a communications toolkit. So as VP of Revenue, at that time I was director. It's hard. I'm in the hot seat all the time, y'all. Funders and investors will email me, sometimes call me at all hours of day. And in my email signature, you'll find that, you know, we're people of color, majority of people of color, staff. We prioritize the well-being of our staff members, and in honoring justice and equity, we've transitioned to a 4-day work week, and we hope you will honor that time for us. It says it in everything. We had a toolkit that, you know, went out for staff members to utilize for out of offices, to communicate to partners, to communicate to stakeholders. And, you know, we really positioned it strategically in all of the materials that were going out to external stakeholders we were accountable to for our organization, that's impact investors, foundations, policymakers, and all of that. So we were very strategic in everything we were writing and putting out in the world, that this 4-day work week, this concept of redesigning work and focusing on not just the scarcity and perfection mindset, but the humanity of the nonprofit workforce was just like embedded. And almost so that it wasn't just a thing that we were doing, but it was the ethos of the organization that they were supporting.
So following on from that then, it doesn't sound like you had a difficulty with this, but from a cultural perspective, we know that shorter working weeks do not fix a bad culture. That's in the organization, it just highlights that. Was there mindsets that needed to be changed? Maybe yours, I don't get back to you in the evening. You know, did mindsets have to change? How did that look?
All right, I was having this wonderful discussion with Colette and how I pride myself in being a New Yorker and always having like a go, go, go mindset and just like hustle culture, doing everything like all the time. And I'm a pretty tactical person. That needed to change very quickly, you know, because I couldn't approach things all the time with tactics. And how am I going to approach this in a to-do list of 10 things, you know? I needed to be a lot more thoughtful about the strategy that went in there. I needed to prioritize impact over just like progress and, you know, just activities. And that was a cultural shift. That's an absolute mindset shift that, you know, you're not trained in college, in your early careers, or in your jobs to really think about, how do I want to approach this work impactfully? What are the things that I need to prioritize that are big picture, that are long term, and how do I want to fill my days with my day with the other projects that are equally essential, but may take up too much time, and who do I need to collaborate with? So the things that came up as cultural challenges, I want to say, believe it or not, in the focus groups, people vocalize, be like, you mean we have less time to do the work that we're doing? We're already burnt out trying to do the work that we're doing. How's this gonna work? The moms of the group and like the parents of the groups also said, my days are already like kind of like my mind's scattered, and now I have less time to do the things. And we're like, look, we're not asking you to only prioritize your work and your schedules. This is a collective effort. And we have to look at, well, how do we rethink prioritization as teams entirely, right? And how do we rethink time entirely? The other thing that was really hard, and it took a lot of trainings to get through, was addressing power balance. So organizations are inherently hierarchical, right? And oftentimes those that are in junior positions look for delegation, don't voice concerns, have like a roster of things that are in their docket. We really had to do a lot of trainings around radical candor. How do you manage up? How do you say no? How do you push boundaries? And that's from the ground up. And for managers, well, how do you center equity? If that's really like, the center and the nucleus of our organization, how are you practicing it in being a manager and supervisor? And are there blind spots that you have as a leader? Those were like the cultural murkiness, that it's just mindset. And it really takes time to rewire your brain from a traditional way that you've always done things.
So you're rewiring your brain, so you're getting on top of the culture things. Of course, you know what, I'll use this. From an operational point of view, what was the one biggest thing you needed to change? You can think of one thing. What did the organization need to change to make this a success?
Meetings.
Meetings.
Yeah. Even before you finished asking me that question, because our days would be stacked. We're in a remote organization, right? My Monday mornings start with meetings. So we really had to restructure how we met, ways in which we met. So shorter meetings, quick updates immediately became either stand-ups, 15 to 20 minutes, or Slack. We had to go through an organizational audit and just leveling of how we use our tools. Slack is for if I were in the office with you, right? Email is long form, it has deadlines, it has accountability, and probably has multiple stakeholders from different teams. Longer strategy session, I forgot the gentleman that asked this, like, how do you build creativity time somewhere? Yeah, so we had intentional longer strategy sessions that were built in by different teams, and they were mandatory, and they were necessary to move the organization forward in the various projects that we were working on, specifically around innovation, because you can't strategize your way to innovation. I don't know if that's a thing, but we had sprints. So there were intentional 2-week times where our teams would go through design sprints. So for the revenue team, I don't practice fundraising as pro forma as most nonprofits would. So I wanted to experiment with 4 different ways of reaching out to investors, engaging with high net worth donors and all of that. And we workshopped them through 2-week sprints where we had dedicated 3-hour block times just dedicated to this, right? And we had to be intentional about in-person time. So retreats, figuring out who your first team is. So at Common Future, the other VPs, they're my first team. And we uniquely are a decision-making body, and we uniquely figure out how we want to collaborate together, and where we want to opt out from, because not everything needs us. So meetings were 1,500% the point of contention, especially for inter-team collaboration. And just building it and we learned this the hard way after our first year's survey results, that we need to build in unstructured learning time. We need to build in different ways of coming together creatively, because that's something that the staff members are craving.
Yeah, and when you're making all these changes, and this is what leaders always want to know, is how are you measuring it? So I hope there's leaders in this room that are thinking of doing this. How are you measuring performance? So how do Common Future measure?
Yeah. So obviously we had a pre-survey, post-surveys, and we have our culture survey now that we've always done each year, that has this 4-day work week experiment, and just like how we work differently, questions embedded in there. We're now a staff of 43 individuals all across the country. I also encourage you to explore technologies. Automation and tech isn't bad. Why do I say this? We had organizational key results, performance reviews and everything, but we soon got to realize the systems and how we were approaching it was very cumbersome, and that was taking time in itself. So we integrated technologies like Lattice into Common Future to really track, well, are we meeting the things that we're saying we're meeting in our 3 to 5 year plan, right? And then breaking it down by team, then breaking it down by individual, and then breaking it down even to the minute check-in that you have with that individual, insofar that you know that their time in that 32 hours that they have with your organization is maximized.
It seems like it's been an absolute massive success and it's changed their life and
Yes.
your team's lives. What would be your final message or tips of advice? Anyone who's thinking of doing it, or in fact anyone who's thinking of sort of pitching it to their boss or their board, what's your advice for those people?
Yeah, I can't stress enough what Joe said earlier in his presentation in terms of redesign. Time is a facet of that, but you really have to think about redesigning work. It's not a silver bullet that's going to solve like employee morale, or you need to get onto this craze, but you really have to figure out how you want to redesign your work for the maximum amount of impact. And for each of your organizations, that's going to look different. You know, for us, the 3 takeaways for us that we always say, especially for nonprofits that are focused on, you know, community wealth building issues and economic justice and racial justice and all of that, is name power imbalances head on and figure out how to work through them. Figure out, rethink about time and prioritization using the Big Little Rocks framework of what's actually filling your days, the big rocks or the sand or the pebbles, right? And rethink about time in terms of where are your employees spending the majority of their day? Is it in meetings or is it towards impactful work? Or is it just for the activities and the work for the sake of work? I mean, those are hard questions to have. And I think the last thing I want to say is also allow yourself grace. This is learning out. We like to pride ourselves in being like an R&D lab, and we use the word learning out loud experiment all the time to ad nauseum. But I'm going to say it here. This is a learning out loud experiment. It's okay to get things wrong as long as you see this as something that requires maintenance and it's not a one and done deal. But you have to revisit it. You have to recalibrate with your staff around it and continuously revisit it as a work policy and in the ways that you show up for that individual in your company at home, you know.
Yeah, I love that you said that because we always talk about that. It's a journey, you know, and it's okay to make mistakes on the way, and it's better to be honest about that. Rakiva, thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your open and honest, you know, really transparent view of the show. So thank you so much, and don't worry, if you do have questions, Rakiva's going to join the panel. We're going to have a panel discussion now. I am delighted to welcome Hamza Khan, co-founder of Skills Camp. Dr. Patricia Campos Medina is the executive director at the Worker Institute in Cornell. Joe is going to join us again, and Danielle is also going to join the panel. So welcome to you guys.
Okay. Thanks for joining us. So I'm not going to do big introductions for each one of you. We have Hamza here, the co-founder of Skills Camp, Dr. Patricia Campos Medina from the Worker Institute at Cornell University's ILR School, and Danielle, who you heard from earlier on. I'm just going to start maybe with yourself, Hamza. You've done a lot of thought leadership, a lot of writing about the future of work. For you, where does this conversation about the shorter work week fit into the broader future work conversation?
Ooh, what question to start with? By a show of hands, how many people here have a functional definition of the term future of work? Okay. That was a very glowing introduction that you provided. I'm considered a future of work expert, and I gotta be honest with you, there are days where I don't actually know what it means. I asked this question to an audience 2 months ago, and somebody aggressively shouted from the corner, "No one knows what it means." Reminded me of Will Ferrell's character from Blades of Glory. No one knows what it means. It was provocative, gets the people going. So when we talk about the future of work, we're really dealing with 3 big questions that have no easy answers. Number 1, who does the work? Then we go into when, where the work is done, and then how the work is done. think it's increasingly important that we ask a fourth question: why the work is done in the first place. So I see the issue of time. We're talking about reducing the amount of time in the work week. That's very much a keyhole issue into the why of work. We're really looking at the super metric at the heart of why people are disengaged at work. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about reducing the work week. We're talking about reducing the work day. We're trying to reduce misery for employees. We're trying to improve productivity for employees. And we're ultimately trying to help them align their personal why with the organization's why. So I see the 4-day work week as an inevitability. We've been moving in this direction for a very long time, for at least 250 years. If we're counting back to the Industrial Revolution, right, 1760. I hope my math is right over there, around 250 years. You shared something very interesting, Joe. You said that the 4-day work week is buried within the infrastructure of the current work week, and I couldn't agree more. So much of how we spend our days at work is just muddied by distraction, persistent stress. It's there. The structure is right there. But if we were to just declutter the work week, if we were to just be more focused in the work that we do, I think we could all arrive at first the 4-day work week, and then eventually the 3-day work week, eventually the 2-day work week, and we might even get back to how humans spent, at least for 95% of human evolution, 15-hour work weeks. So that I see as an inevitability. And I mean, the case that was made earlier by all the previous speakers, I'm in agreement with. I think that the what has been clearly explained. I'm very curious with all of you to explore the how. How do we actually get there?
Thanks for that, Hamza. That was fantastic insight. I'm going to go to you next, Patricia. I have to say that there's probably a big gratitude owed from me to Patricia for the fact that I'm even here, because I was a visiting researcher with Cornell University when I led the global pilot program here in the US. Patricia, in your role, the research you do, the advocacy you do, I think it's fair to say you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on with workers and with the labor movement. So where do you see this issue being positioned? You know, we've seen the UAW in recent weeks. How do you see this playing out as a big issue for the labor movement here in the US in the coming years?
So at the Worker Institute, which is part of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University, we are focused on figuring out what is the future of work, what is the future of workers, and how do we make sure that we are incentivizing the creation of workplaces that actually focus on the welfare of workers. And that, at the end of the day, for us, in our research and our training and education program, has to do with how do we return the idea of dignity and value in workers' contribution to our economic output, right? We are ultimately in a capitalistic society that measures the value, unfortunately, of workers in how they are contributing to the economy. So I am very proud that we at the Worker Institute focus on what, and myself as a political scientist, focus on what are the trends, how are workers shaping the demands of society, how are they negotiating day to day in direct negotiations with employers, but also through collective bargaining and unions, and through social movement demands. How are they demanding more respect and more dignity from the job? And I think that the 4-day work week sort of fits right in the moment in which workers, not just young workers, but women of color, workers of color, LGBTQ plus youth, are demanding a different return on their investment from the labor from corporate America. I saw a graph that you show at the beginning when you have a graph that's going down in the terms of how much time workers are spending at work, and it went down and it stopped around the 1970s. I often show a graph in which it shows how worker productivity skyrocketed during the same time. So workers have been producing more, doing more worker productivity, and another thing that got stagnant during the same time was worker pay. Worker pay was stagnant during the last 75 years. So and it got worse during the 2000s. So I think that what we're seeing this renewed demand coming from the UAW. And I always have to remind people that it was the UAW through the flimsy down strikes in the 1920s and 30s that actually got us a 5-day work week. Ford adhered to it because they were shutting down his production plants in the 1920s. So it was workers who demanded a 5-day work week and a weekend. Just like that we had the saying, women were saying at the turn of the century, we want bread and roses too. And I think we're seeing that again. Even nurses in hospitals are demanding less work, more flexibility. That doesn't mean on-time scheduling, though. More flexibility doesn't mean on-time scheduling for workers. So I think that we are positioned, this issue right now, and the fact that the UAW is bringing back the same demand that they had in the 1930s for a 5-day work week, now they have one of 4-day work week, it sort of coincides with where workers are at. So this is not just a professional blue-collar workers or highly educated corporate America issue. It's not just for your office staff. It's also for your frontline employees, and it's also for your for manufacturing. Those who are manufacturing, that workers are demanding more time to spend at home, and actually a return for their investment. Workers want to get paid for what they're giving, and they want to be remunerated. And this whole idea of making a trade-off between gig work that is supposed to give you flexibility and low wages, and more time that you are actually remunerated for the labor that you do. So I think that we're in the right time, and I think that when you came over and said I want to go do this, that was just before the pandemic, and I said, oh, okay, that's a great idea. And the pandemic hit, and everybody was like, this is the right idea. So I congratulate you for your foresight on doing this issue. But I think we're in the right moment to make this a reality. But it's not just a responsibility for you to think about this issue from your office employees or for your professional employees. You also have to be thinking about how this translates into frontline workers and production workers, because it's not a demand that is going to go away. Young workers are quiet quitting. Young workers are saying, I'm only going to work 80% of my time. I'm not going to sacrifice my mental health. So we are not in this race to the bottom that we used to be. So I think the workplace has changed, and the future of work is not going to look like we are accustomed to. I'm a Gen X, and we used to have to prove, stay late, get there early. I don't think that's the generation we have anymore. So.
Thanks for that, Patricia. And yeah, I mean, like with lots of good ideas, there needs to be foresight, but there needs to be a lot of good fortune. And I think a lot of people have coalesced in recent years for this issue to really come back on the table in a big way. Danielle, as we've already heard, voice for your generation of workers, putting the issues that matter to Gen Z workers out on the table. What do you see this? We talked about this as a priority for young workers. How would you share the priority that young people would give to having more time off and having time back at the moment?
Yeah. So just to put it into context, right? You talked about sort of the future and what it could look like, and then you talked more a little bit about what we actually look like as a country, right? And blue collar, white collar, but however you look at it, when you think about Gen Z and you're looking at this generation, right? A lot of people like to talk about the future of work and the future workers, but not a lot of people are willing to necessarily invest in future workers, and let alone reimagine how we work, right? And so when I think about Gen Z, I think the most culturally diverse generation of all time, right? Going back to who are we talking about, and also a generation that does comprise our future workforce. And the key distinction with this workforce is that we have options. Although a lot of Gen Zers are still living at home, I think around 40%, because we are growing up with more privilege. There's more money available. There's more immigrants that have made it, like my dad. He made it, and I luckily got to grow up in Manhattan. I'll take myself as an example. I have the ability to, if I don't like what's happening in the workforce and what the reality might be and what my options are, I have the ability to launch my career as a Gen Z speaker. I have the opportunity to launch my career online as an influencer. I have the opportunity to connect with incredible people like Joe and collaborate, although I've only been in the workforce for whatever X number of years, right? You could look at it that way. And also, what does that represent? It represents a generation that does not agree with being silenced, that does not agree with this one-way mentality of this is how we do things. And so when I think about the future of work and the 4-day work week, I think we need to be embracing new options and opportunities, because that's what this next generation is thirsty for. We're hungry and we're thirsty and all of the above, because we've arrived with maybe conceptions of what work might be, or maybe college for 74% of Gen Zers hasn't actually prepared us for the workforce. And so we arrive a little bit blind, and when we get to the workplace, we question, do I really belong here? And that's when it goes back to personal choice. And so, of course, during times of economic downturn, and maybe a little bit right now, it's a employer-led market. You could see it as that way. But in reality, my opinion is that it actually is never, it was never, and is never, because the companies that will actually win in the long run are doing things like this. They're experimenting and asking themselves, what is the value of our time? How are we utilizing our time? And how are we seeking to make work better for everyone? And just like off the top of my head, one of the bigger, you said it before about mental health, 98% of Gen Z, according to a survey my friend Shireen did with her company, The Curve, 98% of Gen Z has experienced burnout, has had an experience with burnout. And when you think about that, and you think about the results of the 4-day work week, or scaling your time back, it just makes a lot of sense at the end of the day. That's kind of how I see it.
Thanks for that. That was fantastic insight. Okay, predictions time. Very hard to predict the future, but I'm going to ask you to try. So is this going to be something where it's going to take off? It's going to accelerate? We're going to see AI shared in the form of reduced work time in a way that we haven't seen with technologies in recent decades? Is it going to continue to be a niche thing that some employers do for competitive advantage, maybe because they can't pay people as much? Or is it going to be a fad that's going to die out post-pandemic? Where do you see the shorter working week play? What role do you see it playing in the future work? And start with you.
Yeah, for sure it's not going to be a fad. As I said earlier, we've been moving in this direction for a very long time, especially if you reverse engineer this to its origins. It takes us right back to the factory context. We had to organize people working together that had to produce outputs based on, or had to produce outputs that would lead to outcomes. They were very much linked together. And then that led naturally to the theory X style of management, which is top-down command and control, and where we've been moving eventually is the theory Y style of management. And I love everything that you shared, Danielle. That's definitely what modern workers want. They want freedom, they want flexibility. I was thinking about an effect and it finally came to me, the endowment effect. The endowment effect is an emotional bias that people experience when they receive something and they attribute more value to it once they've owned it. So when you think about the 3 weeks or even the 3 months that people spent working at home, if they had the luxury of doing so, they were able to discover that they enjoyed working at home, they were able to be productive working from home, that the profits were flowing within the organizations. And now to force people to go back into the workplace, to force Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 strict work weeks, to bring back that top-down authoritarian style of management, it just isn't going to work. There's been let's call it what it is, there's been a class consciousness upgrade. We know better. We want better. We want better for ourselves. And so it's not a fad. It's not going to go away. This wrinkle in time that we've experienced over the last 250 years is just that. It's a wrinkle in time. Like I said, it's estimated that for 95% of human history, we worked 15-hour work weeks. Right? That was it. And then suddenly there was a compression in the last 250 years where we started working 14-hour work days. We worked 7 days a week. It was just in 1920 where you had 10-year-olds that were working in coal mines here in the United States. I mean, I could just go on and on about just the egregiousness of the U.S. workplaces or the workplace culture that we're even seeing now seep into the present. So I'm optimistic that we're going to undo the destructive leadership. Let's just call it that. We're going to undo the destruction caused by autocratic leadership that we've experienced in the last 250 years. It'll be gradual, it'll be sudden, it's going to be messy for the gradual period, but then suddenly we're going to see a shift. And I estimate that shift is going to take place by no later than 2030, given the pace, the exponential growth of artificial intelligence and all the technologies that I'm sure everyone in this room right now is enjoying and we're seeing. I mean, I think I'm going to work 22 cumulative hours between now and December as a public speaker. In terms of like 22 engagements on stage, 60 minutes per engagement, that's 22 hours. Everything else though, right? Everything else that I'm doing around that, I'm hyper engaged with. I love doing it. I love doing it on evenings, weekends, and that's the same for my team as well. I have a very international team. They love the work that they do. I've engaged them. I've invested them in the work that they do. We don't actually track hours in our workplace. It's all outcome based, and wherever they choose to get that work done, however they choose to get that work done, my job as a leader is to remove all of the obstacles from their path and involve them in the decision-making process. So I love that we're having this discussion today about what a 4-day work week could look like. But I would encourage all the leaders here in this room to turn that question over to your team and ask them what they want. How do they choose to work? Are they blenders? Do they, like me, choose to blend work and life together? Are they splitters, like my sister? Do they want to just have a strict Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and then cut off work after they leave and go home and enjoy a life that's distinct from their work week, from their work day? So, long story short, it's going to happen. It is inevitable. It's going to be gradual. It's going to be messy, but then it'll be sudden by no later than 2030. That's my bet. If I had to.
Okay, thank you for that. I wasn't expecting such a specific prediction, so I appreciate it. I didn't think you were going to put a time frame on it. Patricia, how about you? Are you willing to put a number on it?
That is specific, I don't know, but I do agree with the fact that it's not a fad, that we are moving towards a different workplace where the 4-hour week or more flexibility in the workplace, it is going to be the how companies who are successful will operate. Not just because workers are demanding it, but also because those companies that want to attract talent, who want to attract innovation, who want to be ready for innovation, have to change. And it's not gonna. I think it's gonna happen. There's industries that is already happening, and there's other industries that have to adapt for it to happen. But we think we are exhausted from the last 80 years of the industrial revolution, and like trying to keep that pace. And this economy changed already, and the United States is no longer a manufacturing industry. We are, service oriented. We are innovation oriented. So we're changing. The other thing that's happening is that if for companies to bring back and keep women in the workplace, which are critical, they also have to be more flexible. Women are demanding the flexibility and the earnings that they haven't had. Equal pay is a real thing, but also the flexibility. So I think women are changing the workplace as well, and every company is trying to compete for the talent of women in the workplace. So companies who want to stay competitive have to change, and workers will continue to demand. So I think that we will see the 4-week a reality in my lifetime.
Okay. I want to invite Rakiba to rejoin us, and Danielle and I, as well as our panel, are going to be available. We're going to turn it back over to the audience one more time. So, who wants to come in with any questions that maybe you didn't get the chance to answer earlier, either for all of the panel or for specific individuals here?
I have a question for everybody. Who is stuck on implementing a 4-day work week? Who's actually trying to do this right now in your respective workplace, and where are you getting hung up?
I'm Gopi. I have a startup called My Check-ins. It actually, I can speak to you about this one. We actually have reduced the number of meetings in the workplace. So that's our product does. But I have a team based out of India and Dominican Republic, and we implemented 4-day work week last year. And unfortunately, I had to close down the India office for several reasons. The biggest problem that we ran into was when we rolled out for 4-day work week, the core group was like really receptive of the idea. They were, we adapted it very well. But later on, when we recruited new people, these were not like the people who bought into the complete idea of 4-day work week. That's one situation. Another thing is we had unlimited holidays, and then especially in India where the festivals and the holidays come in not at a predefined schedule, where they can scatter around during the entire year, like during Monday, Tuesday, doesn't really matter. So that's kind of creating a lot of imbalance, and that's why we had to take that out for now. But we are actually still experimenting with the Dominican Republic team and the US team. So I think my question was, in terms of expanding into various countries, how do you see what challenges do you see, and what can you do differently?
I could take that. I was just in Israel for a program where I was actually getting to engage in venture capital funds and startups and accelerators, and I saw a huge cultural difference in terms of their perspective on the future of work and flexible work and work from home and remote work, and I was kind of floored because you know, you come from the U.S. and as someone who talks about innovation all the time, and I was like, well, Israel, such an innovative place, like, why are we kind of stuck in the past in this former way of working? And after talking to several people about it who work in Israel and who intentionally got remote jobs not at an Israeli company, I realized a few things. But the most important thing and cultural difference was in Israel, they go to the army. When you're 18, you get drafted. And there are a few great things about that, right? And one of them is that it really bonds people together. There's this sense of pride and patriotism that I think we have a lot less of here. And also at the same time, the army mentality of you have to do what I say, and it's very top down, and it's very much, you know, I have to see you do it in order to believe that you did it. It's less outcomes based, it's more time based. I think that really plays into the culture and spills into the culture of work. And so there's a lot less trust across the board. I think it's also due to the fact that Israel, it's not a war zone, but there's bombs coming in all the time. There's a lot of things happening within the country itself. And therefore people grow up with this sort of, my dad was born there, like I know this, there's a little bit of trauma. And so I think overall, to answer your question, you have to think about what are the conditions in which people are growing up, what are the conditions in which people are, you know, how are they entering into the world, and how could you potentially seek to fill any gaps that might exist in order to get that group of people or that culture to a place of like acceptance, or where more trust can be built.
Kofi, can I take a stab at your question as
Sure,
well?
please.
Mutual accountability is so hard to build.
Yeah.
Okay, especially when you have global, regional, cultural differences. One of the things I forgot to mention, one of the things that we saw after our first year 4-day work week implementation was that people stopped taking PTOs. Oh, shit, what happened? Excuse my language. But yeah, because I used my Friday mornings to go farming at Queens County Farm with my daughter. I didn't see the need to like go on long, lavish vacations, you know, because I was building in a work-life balance in my week. So people really stopped taking PTO, and combined that with COVID. So one of the policies we came out with is just like, you don't accrue PTO beyond a certain amount of hours if you don't take it. So you must also send your PTO and taking time off. We have organizational reset weeks, which is collective rest weeks, that when we did an audit of our calendar, we figured out which 2 weeks those were. I work with teams in Singapore, Latin America, and Europe. And one of the things that I don't like the term 4-day work week. I like work time reduction because I've over communicated to my bosses, who are the co-CEOs, that hey, if I'm on a Singapore call at 9 p.m. New York time, that means that you're going to see an abbreviated hour from me, or whatever, the following day. And we've built in trust that there's do not disturb times, right? And those are kind of sacred. But that all requires a level of mutual accountability and radical candor that takes deep spaciousness, trust to build, and it's hard work.
Okay. And I really enjoyed our conversation earlier about your policy, and would love to follow up about structure and design, and maybe, because I think he's going to give it another crack. So I see Jean, and then I'll go to the lady at the back.
Yeah, so this is really a very rich discussion and provides a vision for how we want to move, or the way we want to live our life, structure our society, structure our work. And it's very encouraging, some of the information you provided, Joe, in your presentation. But I was struck by a couple of things. One is, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the positives that are emerging around this are focused primarily in the nonprofit public sector. The application in the private sector is, I see as, problematical based. Not that it shouldn't happen, the UAW is fighting for it, but I wonder how many people in this room have been to a UAW picket line urging the union on to win this strike, because they're also talking about a 40% pay increase. And some people I heard on TV say, how dare they ask for 40%? And the union guy said, well, the boss has a 40% increase, he's now making 22 million instead of 17 million. Oh, but that's different. Okay, thank you, that's different. The question I'm trying to put out there is, what do we do about the fundamental dynamic in capitalism, which is profits are made by exploiting labor? I'm thinking back 30 years when the team concept was put in plants. The team concept became a disaster because the employers used it as a tool of manipulation to play workers off against one another, which is a time-tested way of capitalism dividing and fragmenting the workforce. So the word exploitation and how do we reduce that and give workers more leverage and bargaining power has not been part of this discussion tonight. And instead of people having more options, excuse my French, most of the workers that I deal with, they're trying to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And the idea of them working less than 4 days a week is impossible, because the rate of inflation, they can't pay the rent to live in New York City. So these economic realities for the vast majority of the people who live here is a real issue. So how do we take the exploitation dynamic of capitalism and minimize that and reduce that? And that to me is like a big question that undergirds all the total sane idea that this is, to give us, Patricia made reference to the famous poem from a strike that took place, the Bread and Roses strike. We want bread, but we want roses too. And in Union Square in the 1880s, when they were fighting for the 8-hour day, the chant was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Back then, they were trying to have a life. They didn't want to be beyond work, but we're a long way from that. We're a long way from that. The United States, we work more hours than any other country in the Western world. So how do we reduce that? This is one strategy, but the exploitation dynamic is what, to me, has to be addressed, or this is not going to change the vast majority of society's inequality, which continues to go this way. That's my concern.
I'd like to come in very quickly on that, and then I'd like to defer to some of my other panel members. I think the first thing here is that, it's a tried and tested bargaining union labor strategy over many, many years and centuries that, you know, you win in certain places to expand outwards. And there's a reality here that there are certain sectors and there are certain industries and there are certain professions where this is going to be easier to win in the immediate term, and the chances of expanding that across the economy are going to be much greater if you can have those successes in certain areas. The second thing I would say is that this needs to be a combination of a few things. There is a need for private sector leadership. I think that the case studies, the success stories, the evidence that you can point to as a result of organizations like Unilever, organizations doing this of their own accord because they think it's a good idea for employee well-being, for competitiveness, I think that strengthens the case. We need some government intervention in certain places. You know, even if it's not, like, I don't personally believe that compelling mandatory legislation is the right move for today, but I think that we do need, you know, if you look at Belgium, you look at Portugal, you look at Spain, you look at Iceland, where they've managed to extend it now to 85% of the economy, you know, governments are leading pilot programs, research projects. And then I think the third dimension is the collective bargaining union side of this. And I think it's only through a combination of all three that this is actually going to become, you know, the norm, if it does become the norm. But I think in certain countries, some of those are going to have a bigger role than others. And the unfortunate reality is that in the US, the power balance is very different to where it is in Iceland. And so as a result, the leaders are probably going to be different in Iceland to who they're going to be here. Hamza, Patricia, would love to hear your thoughts.
Give me the hard question here. I mean, there's no doubt about it that, you know, we believe that in order to turn that tide, right, what we need is more collective bargaining power for working people, to shift the balance of power from corporate America. You are as a corporate leaders. You know, we neoliberal economic policies in the 1950s actually one of the driving forces of that expansion of capital was that you reduce the power of organized labor. So we have been in a decline of organized labor for 30 years, which is not that it happened because the unions didn't do the job. It happened because structurally the economy changed and the jobs changed, and the jobs that were being created with corporate America sold this idea that if you negotiate directly with me, you get a better deal from the market. That individualistic notion of, you know, going to the gig economy, you have more flexibility. We promised that to young people in the 1990s and 2000s, that, you know, you become a gig worker and you can work wherever you want. I mean, that's the whole idea of the Uber platforms, right? So I think that what we're seeing is a reaction to that idea of workers being better off by being individualistic. What we're seeing is, now we're seeing that there's a movement there that understands that the only way workers are going to have change the norms in society, the norms and expectations from the employer, is that they have to bargain collectively. And I think unions are in a resurgence. There's a lot of, we have to, and I challenge corporate leaders and all of you who are in corporate America to actually not oppose that. You know, stop opposing workers having a collective bargaining rights, the ability to negotiate, because they are actually, what they want is to make their work better, which ultimately will benefit you and will benefit society. So I believe that we do a lot of work at the Worker Institute to advance collective bargaining power and collective bargaining rights for workers. And that doesn't mean that we don't engage in a capitalistic society in which we don't want corporate America to be successful, but the amount of capital extraction for workers going to CEOs has to reduce because our income inequality is too high and unsustainable. And Jules has said before that young workers have more options, and workers still living at home because they're more wealth. That's not the reality for the majority of Americans. They're still home because they cannot afford to have their own apartment. They cannot afford to live on their own, and their parents cannot afford to sell their house because they're underwater on the mortgages. That's a reality for a whole generation of people in this country, and it is through work and returning dignity to work that we're gonna change that dynamics.
And
Thanks.
just to clarify what I meant earlier is that people are Gen Zers are living at home because they have to.
Yeah.
Not because they want to. Because rents are too high, as you said. And because, yeah, sure, we have options and we're going to take that option. Let's say, you'd rather live at home and not have a job that you hate than try to be in corporate America fitting someone else's box of what you should be doing and have your own apartment, if you can even afford that. And that apartment would probably be 400 square feet. And you'd probably be sharing it with 2 other people. So that's the reality, and I agree with you. But just to clarify, that's what I meant. It wasn't that, we have options and we're living at home and enjoying life. It's actually, we live at home because we have to. I think it's like 40% or something around Gen Z.
Hamza, very quickly, because I want to move on to some more questions.
Sure, yeah, to very quickly illuminate your point, Dr. Medina. In the early 1800s, the average CEO pay was 20 times the amount of their lowest paid frontline worker. The average tenure of a CEO at that time, a leader, it depended because they usually worked up the ranks. They were part of the company. They saw it from frontline all the way to leadership. Now the average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO is 5 to 6 years, and the average pay is 400 times the amount of their lowest paid frontline worker. So it's Gene, by the way. Gene, what you were saying, I was getting started. I was getting fired up. I was ready to flip the table. God damn it, Gene, let's go. You cited a couple of really interesting inflection points in labor organizing and labor history. One that I would recommend everybody here become aware of as soon as possible, but it's going to require quite a leap into a rabbit hole. It was a before and after revelation for me, the 1886 Haymarket Affair.
Yep.
Let me just give you this. It's September 27th now, I think, right? Earlier this month, we celebrated Labor Day. But look up why in 1924, I believe, President Grover signed an amendment to Labor Day, separating it from May 1st and putting it to September 1st. Once you start with that inquiry, see where it takes you, you will be enraged, you will be motivated to keep on coming back to events like this, to create a community of people who are going to demonstrate through private practice that this style of working is not only possible, like I said earlier many times, it is inevitable, and it is ultimately in everyone's best interest. What's that saying? Until everybody's free, nobody's free.
All right, I feel like everyone's warmed up now. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to take, I have 2 hands, I'm going to take them together, if that's okay, so that we can kind of keep things moving. I have a lady at the back who's her hand up for one, and I have Sophie. So I'm going to go to you first.
Interclass social movement here that you see started emerging, because there's been such a bifurcation, and like I can't help but think about sitting in a city like this, and we just came from, 555 Greenwich, where I mean the real estate prices and the occupiers, are not the people that you're talking about, and so I'm curious about how you see changing the discourse and the practices together.
Thank you, Sophie.
So, I would say yes and to so much of this. So I've been in the future work for a very long time. And I would say I do believe in labor unions, I do believe in worker activism, but I also see at the same time that, I also really do see the value of that companies are going to be smaller, we have much more remote workforce, you're going to have more and more Gen Zs and millennials, and they're all going to be having multiple clients. One of the core issues is that since the 1960s, people don't have job security here. Zero in this country. Zero. And it's not going to be solved enough by it's not solved by the government, it's going to be solved by the private sector. And I do see that when we get to the place where everybody does have multiple clients, and you'll have companies as well, but more people will have many clients, and you'll have more security that way. There are a lot of things that need to change, and we need something in between a 1099 and a W-2, we need all these things. But that's more where we're going, at the same time that we can try and redress some of the social contract issues with labor activism. So I'm happy that that's, we're getting that too,
But I see in this country, because of the way the private sector works, that it's going to be much more of a rebalancing within the private sector. And there is more movement in that. I do see in terms of the business roundtable that came out in August 2019 saying it's about the stakeholder economy, not the shareholder economy. That's the big move that needs to happen, and it's so important. And it is getting there. I mean, there's also capitalism 2.0. So a lot of things I think that are part of a quasi movement, but we're going in the right direction. But it's going to be very messy.
I mean, I quickly say that there's no, worker activism, social movements. What it does is to change the norms and forces government action. And what we need in this country is government action to force private sector action in creating protections and stability for workers to have careers and to have stability on the job. We have been in a process of reducing the level of government intervention in securing workers' rights and workers' jobs. The expansion of the gig economy, the 1099, that sort of thing. That is the lack of policy intervention in workers' rights enforcement. And if it doesn't happen, private sector will not do it on their own, and it has to go hand in hand. Now, the labor movement has always had a role to play in raising expectations in the floor. We never represented everybody. It's always been raising the floor so that we improve conditions for everybody. It's never been that we're going to represent everybody. It's just that we create the minimum wage. I mean, it's amazing that we still have a $7.15 minimum wage, federal government in the United States, and we have to be fighting for a 15, which is the floor now. The law doesn't have to change. So I think that it's not either or. It's not just private sector has to return to investing in workers and in stakeholders and less on shareholders, but that requires government intervention, and that's what workers are asking for through unionization.
Can I add 10 seconds to that?
Yeah, go for it.
The reason why the nonprofit sector is ahead in the game of this, it is the only sector that has a social mandate to uphold the social contract, right? And focus on stakeholder economy, stakeholder capitalism, and not shareholder primacy or profit maximization, right? But what the nonprofit sector, how many folks know what the labor force of the nonprofit sector in the United States here is? Rough estimate, shoot out some numbers.
Percentage?
Yeah, percentage.
6, 12.
Good guess. Yeah. It's about 11%. Okay, a little more than 11%, and about 3% of the GDP. That's a lot. Okay, and because of the social mandate and nonprofits, specifically philanthropy and impact investors and whatever you might call them, they are the risk capital that is needed to almost lead by demonstration for these types of policies, interventions to take shape and scale. So it's no wonder that this sector is ahead of the game.
Nonprofit or
That's
private
private
nonprofit?
Yeah, 501c3s, yes.
And that doesn't include public sector, which is nonprofit. 11%, I'm just curious.
No, that's separate, the public sector.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to jump in, and I'm really sorry for doing this because the conversation, it feels like it could go on for a lot longer, but I'm already in the space of organizing a work time reduction event that started late. So I'm going to thank Danielle, Patricia, Hamza, Akiva. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Grace.
I'm very conscious, so please just indulge me for 2 more minutes. I have a few things I have to rattle off here, so I'll get them out as fast as I can. We obviously really enjoyed that conversation. I'd love to just thank our sponsors again, Workville, Hungry, Tyler, and thank you so much for being here. This is our first New York event, so we were super excited to be here, but it wouldn't have been made possible without Danielle. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with Danielle. I was blown away by your passion when I first met you, and I'm super excited to work with a young leader like yourself. So thank you so much, and a big round of applause for Danielle.
relation to what we do in the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence, I just think it's important just to make sure that you all know that we're there to help you. So if you're ready to open up the conversation about introducing work time reduction or trying to go back to it, we can help you do that. As you saw earlier from Joe's presentation, there are many steps on the roadmap. Some of the companies that we work with, they're not reducing their work hours today, but it's ultimately where they want to get to. So they're starting to look at their processes, make a couple of changes before they actually reduce their work hours. So if there's anybody in this room that's ready to have that conversation, please let us know. And if you are excited about the idea of a shorter working week, keep the conversation going after tonight. So talk to your friends about it and keep that moving forward. Thank you all again so much, and very safe home.